Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are going to be talking about the location of the tapestry that we've seen in the teaser trailer for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Reborn for Nintendo Switch 2. Now, there's a lot of debate about this tapestry and what exactly is going on here. Some people think this tapestry in this teaser trailer is purely for show, it's not actually a part of the game in any way, and we're only seeing it here for promotional purposes. I don't think this is the case. When it comes to Nintendo games in general, when they're sharing a trailer, it's of stuff that you can actually see in the game at one point or another. And specifically with Zelda, the more recent Zeldas, because there have been Zeldas where there's like an introduction to the game and you won't necessarily find that in the game, but just the introduction where you see it as a cutscene. But in the most recent Zeldas, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, the most recent 3D Zeldas, there are similar things. Like in some of the early trailers for Tears of the Kingdom, there was a depiction of this mural, and we can find that mural physically in Tears of the Kingdom. In Breath of the Wild, to tell the story of the Calamity Ganon, there is this tapestry depicting this ancient hero and this ancient princess fighting against this ancient Calamity Ganon. And this tapestry can be physically found in Impa's house in Kakariko Village. And the way this game is being branded, you look at the logo, it's very along the lines of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as well. And so when I see this, given that it's not just like a flat image, like just a cutscene, but rather a fully 3D rendered object in a 3D space, I am led to believe that we are going to be able to find this physically in the world for Ocarina of Time Reborn on Nintendo Switch 2. And this is a big deal, because this does not exist in the original Ocarina of Time, and this would suggest that there are going to be significant changes to this remake here. And so when you start thinking about things from that perspective, things start to get really interesting. Now, my assumption about this teaser is that it is essentially the beginning of the game. You see, the opening narration is similar to the opening narration for Ocarina of Time. However, there are some key differences here. The opening narration in the original Ocarina of Time is by the Deku Tree. He's talking about himself in first person, and he mentions the boy without a fairy, but there's no mention of supreme deities. In the very beginning, they're talked about later on, the three goddesses, as you progress deeper into the game. And this version is not being told by the Deku Tree, but by someone else, a third person. And something else about this narration is that it's being talked about as if this has all happened in the past. The narrator does say long ago. And so, when I consider this, I am a bit unsure of what actually could be going on here. Something I consider here that I think most will agree with is that this is not the entire introduction to the game, if it is the introduction to the game. Like, clearly the part where we're seeing young Link, that part is definitely part of the beginning, but this narration where we see the tapestry, while I do think it probably is part of the beginning, I think there's more here that's been cut out. And so we're not seeing the entire presentation. There's some context here that's missing. However, I do feel like it's worth acknowledging. While this would be very unlike how Nintendo's handled trailers in the past, it might be the case that this narration and these shots of this tapestry are being done this way for the sake of this teaser trailer, and when we actually see the game, the way it's going to start, the way we see these elements will be a bit, if not a lot, different. Regardless though, this part I feel confident in. I do not believe Nintendo, and whoever else they have working alongside them to develop this project, would have created an entire 3D render of this tapestry in a 3D space, by the way. Like, if you look carefully, this tapestry is being hung up by a gold rod, and you can see an indentation into a wall, in a room, a dark room, but a room, a 3D space. I do not think they would have created this entire thing purely for the sake of this teaser, and perhaps not even for just the opening introduction to the game. I think there's a little bit more to it here. Like, if this introduction was more like what we saw for Skyward Sword, or the Wind Waker, or the Minish Cap, where we're seeing kind of flat images, then it'd be a little bit different to me. But because it's a 3D object, I'm led to believe that they created this 3D object, and it's something we will be able to find somewhere in this reborn world of Ocarina of Time. And so with the assumption, one that I'm confident in, that this is not for promotional purposes here, where might this tapestry physically be in this world of Ocarina of Time? So I talked about this topic in a live stream a couple days ago and I put up a poll, and most people agreed the most likely option would be Hyrule Castle. So let's consider that possibility here for a moment. We have this tapestry that's showing a boy in the Deku Tree here, and the way it's being depicted, it looks like the boy as he is when we start the game. When we play through Ocarina of Time and we find a way to explore Hyrule Castle, does it make sense for this to be here? And thinking it through, I don't think it makes sense. Now, it's possible that it could be kind of like an Easter egg thing. Like in the original Ocarina of Time, you can find some hidden portraits of different Mario characters, which is a very cool thing to find there, and maybe it could be something like that, but that just doesn't make too much sense to me. The existence of this tapestry is suggesting a telling of a history here, a legend of the Ocarina of Time. And so with that in mind, it kind of goes back to the initial argument, well, maybe it's not here because this is an object telling of a past, a legend. Unless we're seeing this in the future, and Ocarina of Time is a game about time travel. Which brings me to another crazy idea. What if this tapestry is not in Hyrule Castle, because it doesn't make sense from a timeline perspective here, at least not during the time where we're exploring around as young Link. But what if this object is in a space that isn't in Ocarina of Time, the original version, but it's in a new space? This new space being the Light Temple, or an expansion of the Chamber of Sages, perhaps being one and the same. You see, the Light Temple is one of a few dungeons that was initially planned to be in the final product for Ocarina of Time, but was scrapped. And it's actually really interesting because in Ocarina of Time, Rauru makes mention of the Light Temple, and you are given the medallion, a reward for beating a dungeon, or at least that's the case for all the other medallions you find in the game. So what if in this remake, Nintendo is adding some new content, which I do think is a part of the implication here of them making some significant changes, and somewhere in this Light Temple, somewhere in whatever this structure would be, this environment, that's where we see the tapestry. If the Light Temple is accessed through the Temple of Time, where time travel is involved, then all of a sudden things become a little bit more possible. Or perhaps the Temple of Time actually becomes more than just like a church, but rather kind of like a dungeon where it is more focused on time travel. That's another possibility here. But you see, what makes this more interesting to me is considering who the narrator is, especially when thinking about this possibility that they could be adding a Light Temple here. You see, as we talked about a few days ago, one of the teases we saw from Eiji Aonuma about this game being in existence had to do with fans not really knowing who Rauru the character is today, suggesting there may be some level of importance or a greater importance for Rauru in this remake now. And when we also consider that now that they've kind of created more lore with this name, Rauru being the name of the first king of Hyrule, this adds a little bit more interesting context to Rauru, the Sage of Light in Ocarina of Time. And given that the narrator in this teaser is not the Deku Tree, who else would be fitting to be the narrator for the telling of this legend or the beginning of this game? Rauru, the wise old man. I know I'm not the only person who feels this way, but Rauru to me, for many years, was kind of like that iconic wise old man in my mind. You know, like the Yoda, the Gandalf kind of thing. I'm sure many of you who played Ocarina of Time back in the day also feel similar, that there's something about Rauru that you're like, this person knows things, this person is wise, I trust them. And there's a lot of hints to suggest that the owl, Kapora Gabora, this owl that guides you throughout your adventure, is just a proxy for Rauru. In other words, Rauru is actually your ultimate guide throughout this entire journey, transcending even time here. If he is hidden in the Temple of Time or the Chamber of Sages, perhaps the passing of time is not really as much of an issue for him. He may be an ancient sage who's been around for far longer than all the others, not living a normal lifespan in this current world of Hyrule, which then makes it more plausible that someone like him could be telling of this legend, of this tapestry that shows a history of the hero, the boy without a fairy. That makes so much sense to me. So now imagine Nintendo is adding a light temple here, expanding upon the lore of Rauru in Ocarina of Time, where we're going to hear him talking, we're going to hear narration, we're going to have a dungeon to explore, and maybe somewhere in this dungeon, that's where the tapestry can be found. To me, this just makes so much sense, and it seems like such a cool idea that if Nintendo was going this far, if they were to be adding this level of new content to the game, they would have to do this. Of course, we're not sure just how ambitious this is. However, we have seen that Nintendo has described this game as a full remake, saying it's been reborn for Nintendo Switch 2. And clearly, we're already seeing changes that don't match up with the original here. Quite a bit. I talked about more the other day in another video. So I do think there's actually plenty of room for optimism here, that we could be seeing some significant new content, and given that it seems like Nintendo's positioning this to be like their big holiday title, I think it's quite clear that this is not a budget release and has more going for it to be more expansive than the Star Fox game we're getting in just a few days here, that I would already say has some pretty cool new content, but the main campaign is 1-to-1. I don't think the main campaign here in this Ocarina of Time remake for Switch 2 is going to be 1-to-1. So if I had to pick between the tapestry just being for promotional purposes or the introduction to the game, something you can't actually find anywhere in the game physically, or it being in Hyrule Castle, or a new light temple, I'm leaning towards it being something having to do with a new light temple. Of course, I'll also acknowledge that maybe they're doing something more with Hyrule Castle, and maybe there's like a depth to it or a basement or something where maybe this can be found and it's kind of like a cool Easter egg there. Maybe it's actually not even in Hyrule Castle, but Ganon's castle into the future a few years later, where something like this might seem a little bit more plausible. That's another idea, but out of all these ideas, I'm leaning most towards the Light Temple. However, I will present another interesting idea. This tapestry is mostly focused on the Deku Tree and the boy without a fairy, Link. We do see a castle there. That castle is probably Hyrule Castle. It even seems like there may be a suggestion to the Light Temple as well. But because I'm entertaining possibilities here, what if that castle isn't Hyrule Castle, but another castle? The Forest Temple. That dungeon has a lot of castle-like elements. It's a huge structure, and there's a suggestion of an ancient history there, but not much is explained in the original Ocarina of Time. If we're getting this more ambitious remake here, where they're going to be filling in more details, perhaps even adding some new content, maybe the Forest Temple could have parts that are telling of the history of the forest or legends. There are portraits and things like that in the Forest Temple, actually. That is a big motif within the Forest Temple. Perhaps that could even include the tapestry, depictions of these beautiful images that may have to do with important history in Hyrule or legends or prophecies, perhaps. And so I think that's another interesting possibility to consider here, which is another exciting idea, expanding on the Forest Temple. And so maybe in the 7 years while Link is away, someone puts together this tapestry, puts it up in the Forest Temple. I would presume that would be Saria, her thinking about all this stuff, her being the sage, her being around there all the time. I think that's very plausible. And so now having considered that possibility, I think it's either in a new Light Temple or it's in an expanded Forest Temple. Those are my ideas for where this tapestry might be located. A Forest Temple that has portraits and tapestries telling of the history of Hyrule and ancient history, and legends, perhaps prophecies as well, or a Light Temple with Rauru, someone who has been overlooking Hyrule, perhaps in a suspended state of time, unless he's relying on his other form, Gabora the Owl, where he can be telling of this legend many years into the future, and it's somewhere within the Light Temple, the dungeon that he is a sage of. Both of those just make so much sense, seem so cool to me, and so I'm guessing it's one of those two ideas. The others seem less likely to me when I think this through. Of course, I am operating on the assumption that this is a more ambitious remake here. If this is something that's more 1-to-1, it could just be kind of like, as I said earlier, somewhere in Hyrule Castle that you can just see kind of like as an Easter egg. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.